Hey, happy Mondays, folks. It's Graham here. I'm on your LinkedIn live feed. Today I'm talking about Audio 2. That one over there, Audio 2. The reason I'm talking about Audio 2 is because you keep asking me about Audio 2. Well, you don't call it Audio 2, but you ask me about things like Clubhouse. What does Clubhouse mean to podcast? So what does Clubhouse mean to audio, to radio? What does audio advertising mean to podcasts? What does Facebook audio mean to podcasts? What does podcast mean to podcasts? So I thought I would talk a little bit about Audio 2 today. It's Monday, and being an audio file, this is my favorite subject. So I want to share with you a little bit about what's going on and why we need to call it Audio 2, not just audio. Why is it something special? Right, let's have a look. Let's zoom in on this bad boy here. Audio 2, what exactly is it? Well, it's a mix of things. You can see these are just some of the players in the Audio 2 space. How about that? That you've got here some of the biggest tech names in the world involved in Audio 2. Just look at the names here: LinkedIn, Clubhouse, Slack, Apple, Himalaya, obviously the Chinese podcast platform, Spotify, Reddit, Amazon, Facebook, Ghana, Blinkist as well. We can throw them in, Twitter, Spaces. What's interesting about this is that it's not only large tech brands, but you have here brands which have very strong communities. And this is a core part of Audio 2 community. And if you look at the breakdown, I'll bring up this slide here. Let's take a look at this to really understand what Audio 2 is. It's the confluence of these three areas: narrowcasting, data, and digital. Let me explain a little bit about all of these. Data is obvious. So for the longest time, if you listen to any kind of content, there was no way that the content owner could know that it was you or this was your behavior. Radio, obviously, being a great example of not really knowing what people actually did with the content and how they interacted with it. And digital then would be an important part of that because it allows scale. It allows us to reach hundreds of millions of potential listeners. If you look at my latest data that I've shared here on the live stream, 1 billion people now listen to podcasts every single week. Every single week. I foresee a time, I don't know, I need to get the data for this, that at least compared to weekly users of Facebook, there may be a time in the next 5 years that there will be as many users of podcasts as there will be users of Facebook. That would be an interesting proposition, wouldn't it? It's probably quite far away at this stage. I mean, it's 1 billion a week on podcasts. I don't know what it is for Facebook. Let's say it's 1.7 billion a week. Facebook. I think there's around about 2.5 billion Facebook users, but that's not real accounts, right? Let's say there's 2 billion at most, and who uses it every week? So I imagine it's going to be soon, in the next 5 years, we'll reach an inflection point where there are more podcast listeners every week than Facebook users every week. I mean, that's one of the reasons that Facebook is involved in Audio 2, because it's such a growing area. And let's have a look at this. We'll bring this back up again. We can have a look at some of the brands in here. Obviously, the obvious players that we've seen are Clubhouse, and then we have the large podcast platforms like Apple, Spotify, Ghana, Himalaya, for example. You have now also on top of this some major players who have the ability to really disrupt this space. LinkedIn, obviously, we're on LinkedIn now. LinkedIn has meddled. It has dabbled with stories. Did you use LinkedIn stories? I'm not a fan of LinkedIn stories. I've seen this on Instagram. I don't think it works so well on LinkedIn. Maybe because of the demographic. It didn't seem to get people's attention. However, the idea of introducing audio may actually be an interesting addition to LinkedIn. If we have a look, if we can just zoom in this, I want to share who I think the major disruptions will be in this space. We talked about LinkedIn, Facebook, without a doubt. Everything Facebook touches is disruptive. They continue to keep at it until they effectively win that market. They did that obviously with Snapchat and introducing stories, Instagram, and so on. They've been eroding at TikTok space as well. However, there's three players here I think are completely underrated because little is known about them. I'm going to put Slack aside. I'm going to put Apple and Spotify aside. And these are the obvious players. Three players I want to talk about, and then one major player which has the ability to change everything. The three players, Ghana, one of the largest podcast platforms in India. India is one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing podcast market in the world. Ghana, I think as user experience is pretty poor compared to Spotify. But then Apple, until very recently, the UX in audio too has been pretty poor. Ghana is a very interesting player. How long they can operate independently remains to be seen. But because they're based in India, it makes them very interesting. Reddit, I feel, would be, if they get it right. The problem with Reddit is that in anything that they introduce, it tends to be fought by the community itself. The community seems to be very resistant to ideas. It's very protective of Reddit. So if Reddit is successful, it's because of the community. If Reddit Audio 2 fails, it's because of the community. So we don't really know how that's going to be. Discord, I feel, is a major sleeping giant here. Microsoft tried to buy Discord last month for $10 billion. That failed. It fell through. Microsoft obviously has a very strong hand in the gaming space with Xbox and Minecraft. And to be fair to Microsoft, it's done pretty well with both, unlike Skype in terms of its acquisitions. So I think Discord is very interesting as an acquisition. It has 120 million users, 150 million users there or thereabouts. So it's 6 to 7 times bigger than Clubhouse. It's an audio chat app. It's been audio since day one. It doesn't have the room type functions that you get on Clubhouse. However, it has servers and it has channels which act more or less like rooms. Discord's very popular with young people, with gamers, and it's making $100 million a year, and it's been around for 6 years. So to me, Discord is an extremely interesting proposition in the audio space. It could be very disruptive. The interesting thing about Discord is now it's rebranding itself away from its gaming roots and trying to be a broader mass market appeal. That would be interesting. It hasn't worked for everything. Twitch obviously tried to do that without much success. And if Discord can get that right, that will be a very interesting proposition in the audio 2 space. So we've talked about Ghana, we've talked about Reddit, we talked about Discord. The one that I think will be the most disruptive here, without a doubt, hands down, is Amazon. The reason is because it's Amazon. And one of the reasons that you can't write Amazon off is, look at their history, that they have the ability to plug away at a vertical or a technology until they get it right. They don't always get it right first time. However, Amazon, when they do get it right, are a force to be reckoned with. There was a time when Amazon just sold books, right? But, who would have thought that Amazon now is one of the biggest cloud computing providers, services in the world? Came out of nowhere. So what would they do in the audio space? Well, Amazon has Audible, and Amazon also I mean, it's got its hands in so many different content providers as well as, Amazon Prime, the video streaming, but also Amazon Podcasts. Amazon Podcast isn't a very strong proposition at the moment. It's part music, it's part Audible. However, like Apple, there will become a time when they flip. If you look at, for example, one thing about Amazon that I want to share with you that's not well known is that they've been recruiting heavily here in Asia the last few months for podcast related roles. So it's very clear that Amazon are long on podcasts and audio too. And the interesting proposition for Amazon in the audio 2 space is that if you look at the major podcast players, Apple and Spotify in particular aren't really interested in B2B content. They don't really support it on their platform very well. Apple, a little bit more so. However, Amazon has a very strong business card. Obviously, with the books, this stuff is easily convertible. You have also a competitor like Blinkist, which has been quite disruptive in the audiobook space. And Amazon must be very mindful of that. That Blinkist is short form audiobooks, effectively. It's summaries of books. And there's a very strong crossover between Blinkist, audiobooks, podcast, and everything that we're talking about here in audio too. So I would say that Amazon possibly is the one to watch here. As usual, they're the last to play their hand, but when they do play their hand, you can pretty much be sure that they've got a few aces in that hand. I would have thought if Amazon went for the business market in audio too, that would be the gap in the market which the others aren't servicing. So let's talk about what audio 2 is and where it falls into the whole audio space. Thanks everybody for joining me on the stream today. It's great fun to share this moment, this experience with you. Hello to Anurag, hello to Ada. The next 2 years will be groundbreaking for podcasting. What I want to do, Anurag, is talk about really how podcasting and audio 2 fit together. Like, for example, podcasting Clubhouse, podcasting, and all the other social audio technologies. That's what I'm going to talk about now. Just reading some of the comments here, some questions here. I'm happy to answer your questions on LinkedIn Live here. Anurag asks, do you think that Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn coming into audio Clubhouse will be redundant? So do I think Clubhouse will be redundant? No. I think it will lose some of its steam just by virtue of the fact that you cannot write off Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Reddit, Microsoft, Slack, and also Amazon. They will obviously cannibalize Clubhouse's advantage, its first mover advantage in time. I don't think Clubhouse has, it's got some great user data, some user numbers. However, compared to Facebook simply adding a room feature like it has to its existing platform, you can see Clubhouse going the way of Snapchat in the way Facebook just took the market away. And Snapchat's still going. However, it's not really in the same form that it once was. More comments about Amazon. Let's read this from Ada Malhotra. Says, social audio for brands, apart from advertising, how would that work? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about. It's a great question. What value proposition would social audio have for a B2B company or a B2... Maybe we can get that comment up, please. Or a B2C company, apart from establishing their leaders as influential voices in their respective industry? Great question. Are we going to get that comment up, engineer? No? Okay. Maybe there's some technical issue. Doesn't matter. All right, let's play on. I will just paraphrase it. So, apart from advertising, how would social audio for brands work? Let's have a look. So, let's talk about it in the context of music. Now, you can like different types of music. Everybody loves music. I'm a big fan of music. Music's been a part of my life since My life started really since I was a teenager. Everything I can think of that was important in my life has a soundtrack to it. And, the interesting thing about music, it's been around for thousands and thousands of years. That is the power of audio. And yet, even in this digital age, it's still going. Everybody said digital was going to kill music, but it didn't. In fact, music is bigger than ever. We have Spotify, we have Apple, iTunes. These are major billion-dollar brands that have existed in the digital era. That it never went away. Obviously, things are a little bit different these days with live performances, but it will bounce back. Music is extremely robust. It's thousands of years old. The problem with music has been, for the longest time, discovery. There was a time when I was a kid, we used to share vinyl and cassette tapes. You would go around somebody's house. So if you grew up in the 80s like me, I'm an 80s kid, right? I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s. So when I discovered music, I discovered early 80s. I discovered sort of new romantic, new wave, indie, punk, all that stuff, right? That was my era. And if you grew up in that era, the way you discovered music was two ways. Firstly, you discovered music through cassette tapes that people shared. You had mixtapes, right? And if you became the guy that mixed tapes for people, you shared them with your mates. And that's how it worked. The other way you would have discovered music was through radio. You would have been listening to radio at night because you would have probably had non-mainstream interests. So you'd have to stay up to like 2 a.m. to listen to your show, which is what I did, right? So that's the only way you could kind of really discover music back then. But there was an integral part of music discovery that there were these existing channels for airplay, and then there was music. So the trouble was, it's like, how did you discover music? When all those channels went away, when music in the form of cassettes and vinyl went away, then we lost our discovery channels. And, what then happened is that, MP3s were filling the void. Napster was born. That became a way for people to share music and to share audio. However, that got crushed by the industry. And then, more legitimate models emerged. Spotify obviously became the most globally accepted discovery platform for music, and I think today #1 in the world. And I use it all the time to listen to music, to discover music, to listen to music I listened to when I was a teenager, and to discover new music. I mean, it's a great discovery tool. I've got into music in the last couple of years that I never listened to, but that's because I don't listen to radio anymore, and I don't borrow cassette tapes from my friends or like albums and so on. So those channels are dead, and now it's Spotify. So you have to understand that in the Audio 1 industry, if we go back to Audio 1, there was radio and there was music, right? These were the two bedfellows of Audio 1, radio and music. They were different, but they were needed. They needed each other. So you needed music because that was the IP, that was the content itself, and you needed radio to discover it. And that was a critical part of that symbiosis in Audio 1, radio and music. You had assets and you had airplay, right? That's how it all kind of worked together. And what's happened over the last couple of years has been this explosion in Audio 2. So the first wave of Audio 2 was podcasts. And if you speak to any podcaster now, the #1 problem that they all have is discovery, promotion. Like, producing a podcast is no longer a problem for people. It's getting easier to produce and harder to promote. That's the macro meta trend that is driving Audio 2 at the moment. It's getting easier to produce and harder to promote. And therefore, when along comes airtime, people jump on it. And that's what's happening in Audio 2 right now. I'll give you an example of this. If you look, for example, can we zoom in on this so you can see? This is what I'm showing you now. This is from Andreessen Horowitz, the venture capital firm, who has a very successful podcast called A16Z. And what you're looking at is their programming schedule for Clubhouse. So what I'm talking about is that their problem is discovery. They have great content in the A16 podcast, but their problem is discovery. So what they're doing for a solution to that problem is they're going on Clubhouse and they are effectively creating airtime for the podcast, right? Let's think about this, right? That Clubhouse and podcasts now coexist because podcasts are like music and Clubhouse is like radio. These coexist and they need each other. Podcast has a discovery problem and Clubhouse solves it. However, remember this, that Clubhouse itself isn't the asset. Clubhouse is like radio. It's simply airtime. When it's done, it's done. It's gone. There's nothing left, right? By contrast, 60 years ago today, the Beatles were playing in the Cavern in Liverpool, right? Think about that. 60 years ago. If I go onto my playlists on Spotify, I'm a massive Beatles fan. I love the Beatles. I love so many different musicians as well, from different eras as well, all the way up to the modern day. But, I'm still listening to the Beatles. And the amazing fact about the Beatles is that those songs were written 60 years ago. And it means that every time I play that song on Spotify, the Beatles publisher makes a little bit of money. Not a lot of money, but a little bit of money. It's a fraction of a cent. However, these songs are getting hundreds of millions of plays, and they're getting them 60 years after they were written. Just think about that as an asset. That is an asset in the truest sense, which is you write it once and then you read it millions of times. You create the asset and then you enjoy the passive income of that asset for 60 years. It's just like a house, effectively. It's like property. So the property in audio too is music or podcasts. You have to own property, right? And then everybody else can rent it and pay you income for that property. However, to publicize that property, you need airtime. Think, for example, like Bob Dylan was playing Greenwich Village 60 years ago, but we are still listening to his songs today. It's phenomenal. So what's my point? My point is about the difference in audio too between airtime and asset. Really what we're talking about with audio too is there's a lot of technologies going on at the same time. If I jump around this presentation, I'll just go back to this. Maybe if we can zoom in on this again. So we understand the difference between airtime and asset. Let's have a look here. Now, these are platforms for discovery, all of them. However, within these, there are properties like music and podcast. What people are confusing right now is people are saying, won't Clubhouse cannibalize podcasts? Or won't Slack impact podcast? Or won't this impact that? In many ways, it won't, because it's like saying, won't radio cannibalize music? It won't, absolutely, because they're very different. Radio is airtime and music is the property itself, which somebody owns. Now, the problem with Clubhouse is that there's no property inside it. It's just simply for promotion and airtime. That may change over time. But if Clubhouse tries to create property inside the platform, it probably will fail, because for the longest time, we've had a natural distinction between the two, and they've worked very well together between airtime and property, that it doesn't make sense if you put it all in one. It doesn't make sense that they could compete, for example, with Spotify and Apple on that basis. So really what this is about is, how do these technologies work together? So what I think, my prediction, and if you're interested in Audio 2, sign up for my Audio 2 newsletter. It goes out every Wednesday. I share all the news on Audio 2, what's happening in the space, what the latest trends are, how the market is developing, the latest data, my analysis of all the most recent technology launches in Audio 2 as well. And really the important part is, how do all of these work together? That's kind of the key to the Audio 2 space, is understanding how all of these either compete or complement each other. My thoughts are, what you're going to see is, over the next year, more of a synchronization between social audio and properties, so like podcasts and music. So what I predict is that you're going to see on platforms like Facebook, on platforms like Twitter, Amazon, Clubhouse, Fireside, which is Mark Cuban's social audio platform, and any other Audio 2 platform that launches, these will then become promotional tools for three types of properties in the next 2 to 3 years. Firstly, podcasts. You're going to see Clubhouse and Reddit and LinkedIn and Amazon being great behind the scenes type channels to promote podcasts. You're going to see these operating as Q&A with podcast hosts. You're going to see these platforms, these channels, operate very much in the same way that radio used to operate 20, 30 years ago. If you look at radio, now the interesting thing about radio, commercial radio in particular, is that it lives and dies by community interaction. What do I mean by that? Is that if you listen to commercial radio, there's phone-ins, there's Q&A, there's questions and answers, there's comments, just like here on the LinkedIn stream. There's readers' mailbag. You even have radio DJs, anchors, hosts go into the community and talk to the audience, the listeners. And that's a really important part of radio. And that is missing from music. That is missing from podcasts. And that is missing to some degree from book publishing. And therefore, the real niche that Clubhouse, Facebook Audio, Twitter Spaces, Amazon, and all of these social audio platforms can occupy successfully is that radio has done so well for 30 to 40 years, which is creating communities for the properties, not to be the properties themselves, but to create an interactive community. Because if you think about it, look at music as an example, Spotify or Apple, the interaction on these platforms, zero, nothing. How can you interact with community on Spotify or Apple? Absolutely zip, nothing. However, community is a massive part of all music, whether you're an AC/DC fan or a Bob Dylan fan or a BTS fan. Community is everything. And yet these platforms don't do anything to support community. Therefore, I believe Clubhouse, Facebook in particular, will become great community homes. The missing link in Audio 2, that they will then create that connection with the properties that doesn't exist. You could say the same of podcasts as well. Look at all the major podcast distribution platforms, Spotify, Apple, maybe Google Podcasts as well, Amazon maybe, Ghana, Himalaya. The community aspect is zero, nothing. Very, very limited. They could easily implement this, but they don't want to. That's the point. If you look at the nearest we have to a podcast hosting platform that has some kind of community is SoundCloud, and that's just really limited in scope, right? So what's going to happen is that rather than those communities form on the distribution platforms, they will form off store in social audio. And the last part, what I think is really interesting, is in book publishing as well, that you have the properties which are books, and you have really a missing link here in the communities that in many cases, the communities have been built around author websites, Twitter perhaps. However, these new social audio channels will provide amazing airplay for authors. They won't actually provide the property. They will be not the distribution, but the airtime that authors need. And so all of this is coming together in the Audio 2 space. You have, on the one hand, properties, on the other, airtime. And really what COVID has done is accelerated that in the Audio 2 space. Think, for example, about music, that traditionally a lot of the community was built in live events, but that is, we don't know. We don't know when, if ever, we will go back to full-scale stadium events. They won't certainly be happening in the next couple of years on the scale that we've known them. And the genie is out of the bottle, meaning that for musicians, they need to build community in a digital way now. And there are sort of like music platforms and so on, but nothing like events. And that's why I think one of the biggest growth areas outside of podcasts, you've got these three big growth areas in audio too, is music communities. You can imagine something like Facebook, how well suited that would be to music in Facebook audio as a way to promote a band or a group or a type of music. You could provide very much short form audio. And going back to the point about, maybe I can just fast forward here, the Audio 2 part, if we can just zoom in on this, the key part of it is narrowcasting, right? And narrowcasting unlike broadcasting, you can broadcast just to AC/DC fans, or you can broadcast just to, like BTS fans on Facebook, right? And that's the beauty of it, that then becomes a really targeted, high value airtime for the property owner. So if we think about Audio 2, we have to think about it in the context of mapping it. And that is understanding what is airtime and what is property. And in the property, you've got three groups. You've got books, you've got music, and you've got podcasts, right? And then all these social audio apps sit around the properties and exist to create community and airtime for those three types of properties. So that's how you think about Audio 2. If you're interested in Audio 2 and where it's going, then sign up for my Audio 2 newsletter. If you're not a member of the Audio 2 newsletter, or you're not signed up yet, it goes out every Wednesday, then just ping me on LinkedIn. I'll add you to the list. And I'll just share my latest takes on Audio 2, as well as you can get access to these presentations as well. I might do that. I might just share them because I enjoy sharing my content as well. So let's take some questions from LinkedIn. Thanks a lot, folks, for joining me for this LinkedIn Live on Monday. Another question from Anurag. He asks, what's your take on podcast distribution platforms promoting their original podcasts more? Will this drive creators to sign exclusive deals with these platforms in the future? It's a great question. So let's talk about Spotify, Amazon, and Apple. Spotify and Apple really are the main players in originals content at the moment. Spotify obviously have already done this. So to the question, Anurag, will this drive creators to sign exclusive deals with these platforms in the future? We've already seen this with Joe Rogan, and the $100 million deal to bring Joe Rogan to Spotify. And you look at some of the comments on Joe Rogan's podcasts published on Instagram, for example, you see a lot of people complaining about that move to Spotify, that a major part of the consumption of Joe Rogan Experience was on YouTube, for example. But with the exclusivity deal, now that's been lost. And so, yes, you're going to see a lot more of this in the same way you saw this with network television and satellite television, buying sports, for example, as their sort of banner content to bring people on and subscribe. You've seen this with Luminary. I'm not sure if that's particularly really scaled, that model. However, you've seen now Amazon's purchase of Wondery, which is a major play in this space because Wondery produces Business Wars, some great podcasts. So now the question is why would they do this? Well, they would do this because if you think about the model of podcasts, that as a distribution platform, if you're Apple, Google, or Spotify, Amazon, you don't actually own any content. You're simply a distributor of content. You're not even hosting the content. You're just distributing the RSS feed. And therefore, there is no distinction between you and the next guy. A lot of now, so the competition is going in two ways. One is originals content, and two is algorithm. So the originals content is bringing exclusive content across to the platform, and the second part is the algorithm. Now, if you think about those two together, that a distributor who doesn't own the content is simply distributing other people's property and has, an interest in developing the algorithm to provide better search. If you take that model, that was Netflix in the early days. Netflix was a DVD distributor. Netflix didn't own its DVDs. It used to send them by mail originally. Netflix then later took that digital. Interestingly, when Netflix went digital, they were considering it as a beta test, really, of their main model. And they just kind of wanted to run it on the side. They initially considered setting up as a different company. However, that became so successful that their online streaming service grew. Netflix then started looking at its algorithm and started asking, how can we improve this? And I can't remember what year it was, but they ran a competition to improve the algorithm, and they offered $1 million to the winner of that competition. And that was won by, I can't remember, some group of programmers, but they won $1 million for a better Netflix algorithm. So you had these two things coming together. One was that they went digital. The second part is they started investing in the algorithm, and then they started creating their own content. Because if you look at in the audio space, the stream revenue for for a podcast owner is very, for example, the advertising revenues are very small. If you're Spotify and Apple, you're paying a lot of money to labels as well for the content. However, if you create your own content, then you can effectively own all of that and get 100% of it. And you can put your own advertising on it, and you can offer subscriptions if you want, like Apple, micropayments. So it only makes sense that originals, exclusive content will become more of what we're going to see in the next 2 years. Amazon acquisition of Wondery is going to be probably a core part of Amazon's podcast strategy. I don't know who else is lining up, but if you look at, for example, the podcast market today, there are a lot of podcast agencies who have networks. A lot of my friends here as well on LinkedIn who own networks which have content which Spotify, Apple, Amazon could buy, because for them it buys millions of subscribers, narrowcast subscribers as well. So whereas the beginning of the originals content starts with these very large banner hits like Joe Rogan or Wondery, what's going to happen is that's going to filter down. What you're going to see is very much localized content. You're going to see narrowcast, micro niches. You're going to see podcast content appealing to 1 million people, for example, or in very much niche languages. You may see podcast content networks in Tagalog or Cantonese or Telugu, Tamil, for example. This is really going to be the gold, the next level. After 2 years, people are going to drill right down, because if you can buy, let's say you could buy a podcast network that is, for example, aimed at Bengali or Tamil, how many millions of speakers do you have in India in those markets? And you have a wealth of content as well that could be easily transported across into these platforms as well. So, once those big sort of banner hits have been bought up, the next level is the micro niches. And my suggestion to anybody in podcast content creation now is, if you're in the business of creating originals, then you should be thinking ahead of the market. Like, it's the old Wayne Gretzky maxim, is skate to where the puck's going, not where the puck is. And the puck is going into those niche markets. So the really interesting space now in originals is content providers who build out tier 2 podcast content. So like in Telugu, for example, or, everybody's doing true crime, but who's doing like the real niche markets? That's going to be interesting, because those are less obvious. A few more comments here. Once more from Anurag. Thanks for your comments today and your input. It's great to see everybody here today. Ghana and Geo7 and other Indian players are releasing originals left, right, and center. Will this impact independent creators? Of course it will impact independent creators. And we're already seeing it impacting independent creators. On one hand, it may help create and educate the market. On the other hand, it may raise the bar on the expectations of customers. No longer will you see, for example, listeners accept one podcast a month. This is what I'm saying to all my podcast clients now, is you can't rely on one episode a month. If you look at the data from my report, that the average podcast cadence in business is 6.3 episodes a month. In consumer, it's probably not too dissimilar. I don't have the data because I don't measure consumer podcasts. But what does that mean? It means that the average podcast is publishing every week. And therefore, if you are an independent creator, you cannot survive now on one podcast episode a month. That's old fashioned. That's old school, right? So what this means and how this will impact independent creators is that it will force independent creators to do two things. Firstly, to increase their production values. It doesn't necessarily mean, like Wondery style content, but you cannot be recording a podcast on one of these anymore. You cannot be recording a podcast on laptop speakers. You can't be doing that anymore, because customers, audiences, are just not going to accept it anymore. If you think, like, I'm old, right? I'm like nearly 50 years old. So I remember in 1998, the original websites, when I had a website design company, the original websites were like, spinning GIFs and gray. They were gray. Like, that was it. And then you had graphics with like a blue border around it. That was like state of the art in 1997, Netscape Navigator and AOL. That was how it was back then, right? And people accepted it. That was kind of cool. That was what it was like. And we are, in the world of audio too, we're in 1998. So our expectations of audio today from independent creators is very much like our expectations of websites in 1998. So you can look at websites in 1998 and then ask what happened next. And that's what's going to happen to podcasts. The same expectations changed. The same demands were placed on independent creators. So that's what we're going into, folks, is that this is 1998, when there were like 1.5 million websites in the world. And today there are like 1 billion. We're looking at a stage where, listeners will no longer accept low quality audio. Listeners will no longer accept once a month publishing. And the second part for independent creators is that they will have to start thinking about promotion. I guarantee every podcast host, podcast agency who is listening, who is joining me here today, I guarantee your biggest challenge today is promotion. I would say that. I would bet my house, my mortgage on that everybody today is struggling with promotion. Everybody today is struggling with audience and organic growth. 2 or 3 years ago, it's very different. 2 or 3 years ago, we didn't have this problem. 2 or 3 years ago, our problem was production. Like, how do I make this thing? How do I distribute it? How do I host this? Those were the questions 2 or 3 years ago. Today, the questions are, how do I build an audience? And that's what everybody's struggling with. And so to the question about how the release of originals is going to impact independent creators, it's absolutely that. It's just going to make it harder and harder for everybody to build an audience. You know, like, think about Amazon as an example. Amazon has democratized publishing for everybody. I've published 7 books on Amazon, and it was easy. I mean, it's okay, there's a little bit of work to do, but it's not as hard as it was in the old days, where you needed proper editors, you needed proper publishers, you had to pay for book bindings. And then along came CreateSpace and Kindle and just democratized, like, the printing press, everything. And what that then did was, it's the same as where we are today with Amazon. It took the market from pre-Kindle to post-Kindle. Pre-Kindle on Amazon, if you had a book, you had a market, you had readers. And when Kindle first came out and you published a book, then what happened was that you had a ready-made audience. Like, there were more Kindles out there than books, effectively, or, you know, like, more demand than there was supply. And so that was great for publishers, and it meant, like, for publishers, that you just had to build it and they would come. And what then happened is because that model was so effective, that people started teaching other people to do the same. Around about, you know, if you look at the early stages of Kindle and Amazon self-publishing, in the early days, after people started to get success with it and make money out of it, then what happened was there was this explosion of teachers who are teaching you how to make $1 million on self-publishing. Like, you can, like, write a book about garden furniture and live on a tropical island and you can make $1 million. And that was the kind of dream that they were selling to people, right? And that's what's happening now on podcasting. There are influencers out there who are teaching you can make a lot of money out of podcasting, just by creating a podcast, getting advertisers and building an audience. It's bullshit. It's absolute bullshit. It's just like we were in the early days of Amazon self-publishing, because the market, by the time those people are publishing their courses, by the time the people are, you know, democratizing the knowledge, the opportunity is gone. You know, and they're effectively making money out of selling the courses to you, not out of doing it themselves. That's the irony now, is they're making money out of the courses and not the podcast. There's a woman who has kind of blown up recently, and I won't say who it is, but she's become quite famous for teaching people how to make money out of podcasting. And she's very much an example of that. But the problem is that her model is no longer effective, because now it's no longer about producing. Now it's about everybody's in the game. How do you stand out? And the only way you stand out is by understanding audio too, understanding how all of this comes together, that you need property and you need airtime, and you need to work these together. In the same way LinkedIn Live is for me like airtime. You need to find yours. What is your airtime for your property? For example, you could be a great musician just strumming away, like playing your chords, right? I'm going to be the next Jimmy Page, or I'm going to be the next whatever, right? However, like, unless you get airtime, you might as well forget it. Nobody will ever know who you are. So it's the same with podcasts. How are you getting airtime for your podcast? And let me tell you all now, I just want to finish with this, right? I want to finish with this one insight. This is where absolutely everybody is going wrong in podcasting today, where everybody is missing the point, is that airtime is not getting your guests to share the podcast on their social media. Airtime is not creating an audiogram and sharing that on your LinkedIn. That no longer works. That is no longer effective. That is not airtime. That worked 2 or 3 years ago. However, we've moved on. And what works now is building community around your property. And that's why Clubhouse, Facebook Audio, Twitter Spaces, whatever Amazon does, all of these social audio apps will become increasingly important to us podcasters. And without them, we might as well be invisible or silent, which is the worst punishment for a public speaker of sorts. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for joining this live stream on LinkedIn. It's great to hear from you and hear your comments. I'm going to drop off the live stream, but if you have any questions about audio too, then I'm here on LinkedIn. I'm not going anywhere. I'm always here on LinkedIn, so you can ping me a comment on the live stream. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, then let me know. Say great, or just like it, just to let me know that it was hitting the mark. It was on the spot. It's like a clap, a round of applause for your performance, for busking. This is like the equivalent of busking in the street. So I don't mind doing it, cap in hand, asking for your approval. Thanks a lot for joining me on LinkedIn. I'm going to be back on Friday, every Friday, LinkedIn Live. I'm coming back with the chart show. I've got data to share. I'm going to share the latest data on podcasts, particularly podcast charts, meaning who is winning, who is losing, and what are they doing? Why is their strategy successful? So if you're interested in promotion, if you're interested in how to grow your organic audience, then join me on Friday for LinkedIn Live for the chart show. And I will count down the top podcasts globally and tear down as well what works and what doesn't work in the name of podcast promotion. So thanks everybody for the comments today. Thanks for joining. Really appreciate it. I'll see you around. I'll be here on LinkedIn. Signing out, Graham Brown. Thanks a lot, folks. Bye-bye.